everything you need to know about server components in Next.js. What are they? What are the benefits of server rendering in general? How are they kind of implemented in Next.js, and how are they even rendered? And then what is this thing that you might have heard before of the RSC payload? What even is that? Well, we're going to cover all that in today's video. So we'll start with what are server components? Well, they basically allow you to render UI on the server. In Next.js in particular, this rendering is optimized through route segment splitting and supports other strategies of rendering. But first off, optimizing through route splitting is basically sending a chunk of server rendered code to the browser for every route to improve performance a bit. And then for other strategies of rendering, you have static rendering, which is rendering at build time. So when you build your application, that is where that code is going to be rendered into UI on the server. Now you also have dynamic rendering, which is rendering at request time. So when the user goes to a certain URL and your browser makes a request to your server, that's then when your server is going to render your code into UI and then send that back to the browser. So it's doing it at request time instead of at build time. And then you also have streaming. And this is where work is split into chunks and streamed to the client as it becomes ready. So I have different videos on this, but you might create suspense boundaries around maybe more computationally expensive code. And what Next.js will do is it will progressively send that rendered code to the browser when it is complete. So if you have a page and then you have a computationally expensive component within that page that you're rendering, well, you might wrap that component in a suspense boundary, send all of the other code to the browser first so the user can still see okay, this is the layout of the page and other stuff can be interactive. But then for that computationally expensive component, Next.js will send that chunk, that rendered chunk of code to the browser once it's ready. So the user doesn't have to wait for the entire page to load. It first gets most of the page, and then you kind of send the chunks that you wrap in suspense boundaries as they are ready. And Next.js regards this as streaming. So it supports these three different types of rendering here. Now, what are the benefits of server rendering? Why should you care? Why shouldn't you just render everything client side and kind of do what a lot of people used to do when just creating more so vanilla React.js applications without using something like Next.js? Well, for one, it helps improve performance when it comes to data fetching because it moves data access closer to your backend, which can improve performance by reducing time it takes to fetch data and the number of requests the client needs to make. So literally just moving the data fetching or the data access to your backend can reduce the time it takes to fetch data in general. And then also it can reduce the number of requests the client needs to make. And some of the most time intensive things in an application are making network requests from the browser. So it can improve performance via data fetching. Also, I'm sure you know this one, security. It can help you prevent exposing different things to the client because you're just rendering on the server. You don't need to necessarily ship that to the client. Also, caching, you can share cached server rendered content across users. Performance, so, similar to the data fetching one and improving performance there. With server rendering, less JavaScript can be sent to the browser, resulting in the browser having less client-side JavaScript to download, parse, and execute. So if you're able to render something on the server and just send that rendered HTML back to the client, well, it's not like you're sending a bunch of JavaScript to the client to then have the client convert that into HTML and then render to the page. You just render it on the server, send that HTML to the client, so the client doesn't need to download, parse, and execute this JavaScript, which can slow down the performance of your application. And on a similar note, the initial page load can be better because you generate the HTML on the server, making the page immediately available to the client. And like I said earlier, the client doesn't then need to download and parse this data. SEO can also be improved because the immediate HTML helps bots index the page and generate other kind of social cards, which can improve your SEO as well as sharing. And then, like I alluded to earlier, with the streaming rendering that Next.js supports server side, you can split rendering work up into chunks and then send them to the client as they are ready. And this is kind of along the lines of partial rendering as well. Now in Next.js, by default, all of your components are going to be server components. So it's very easy to create server components, which is quite nice. And Next.js kind of has you thinking a little bit kind of server first when it comes to your rendering and components. Now you can opt in to client components, which help you add more interactivity. So server components have all these benefits, but client components still have the benefit of being very interactive, meaning the user can click on buttons and type in inputs and actually be more involved and interact with your application. For that type of work, client components are going to be the thing to use for that. And you can use those by adding the use client directive to the top of your client component file or your component file to make that be rendered on the client. We'll cover more about client components here in a future video, but by default, Next.js is going to have all of your components be server components. Now, how are server components rendered? Well, Next.js uses React APIs to render server components. It splits its work by route segment and suspense boundaries. So by default, it's going to render by route segment. And then if you put different suspense boundaries, like I discussed earlier, it's going to create separate chunks for that code that is wrapped in suspense boundaries, which is going to allow you to ship that potentially more computationally expensive code at a later time compared to some other code that may be more so just static content. Now, you can also think about this rendering when it comes to on the server and then what happens on the client. So on the server, React renders server components into a special format called React Server Component Payload, or also termed as RSC payload, which I'll cover in a little bit more detail here. But after it does this, Next.js takes this RSC payload and client component JavaScript instructions to generate the final HTML. And then on the client, the pre-rendered HTML is immediately shown as a non-interactive preview during initial load. Then after that, the RSC payload is used to reconcile the server and client component trees and update the DOM, the document object model, your tree-like data structure of all of your HTML on your web page. And then number 3, JavaScript instructions hydrate, which hydration means to display React components inside a browser DOM node whose HTML content was previously generated. So you generate the HTML and show that to the user, but then you take those JavaScript instructions to display React components inside those previously generated HTML nodes, and then it hydrates the client components, which enables interactivity. And then for this RSC payload here, just a little bit more details on this. It is a compact format React uses to deliver the rendered component tree. So it contains the rendered output of server components, placeholders, and script references for client components. And it also contains the props passed between server and client components. So if you hear RSC payload, they're talking about a compact format that React uses to effectively deliver your component tree to the browser. So to recap, server components allow you to render the UI on the server. So server side, you're going to take your code and convert it into your user interface, all the HTML that you're going to see, and then you're going to ship that to the browser. In Next.js, this is optimized through static, which is rendered at build time, dynamic, rendered at request time, and streaming. The work is split up into chunks and streamed to the client as it becomes ready. Now, the benefit of server rendering is that data access is moved closer to your backend, which can improve performance and reduce the number of requests that the client needs to make. It can help improve security by not exposing as much to the client. It can help improve caching and sharing server rendered content across users. Less JavaScript is sent to the browser, which is, as a good rule of thumb, the less JavaScript you send to the browser, the better your application is probably going to perform, because the browser will then not need to download, parse, and execute as much JavaScript. Initial page load is going to be better because the generated HTML on the server is going to immediately be available for the client. It doesn't need to download and parse that data. SEO can be improved by immediate HTML availability, helping bots index that a little bit better. And then you can also perform streaming and split that work up into chunks. Now in Next.js, server components are the default, so you don't need to do anything for creating server components in Next.js. All of your components are going to be server components by default, but to opt into interactivity, you can use the use client directive at the top of the page, which will make that now a client component. And then finally, server components are rendered by having React take those server components and render them into a special format called your RSC payload, which your RSC payload that is going to include your rendered server components, placeholders, and script references for client components, and then all the props passed between server and client components. And then once it has that RSC payload, it is going to take that and then it's effectively going to ship it to the browser. The pre-rendered HTML is immediately shown as a non-interactive preview. The RSC payload is used to reconcile the server and client component trees to update the document object model. And then JavaScript instructions will hydrate the client components, which will enable interactivity. So hopefully that clears up what server components are, how they're actually rendered, how they're used in Next.js. I know it can be a little bit tricky if you're, really used to thinking client side, but there are some clear benefits of using server components, and hopefully this video helped clear it up. But I'm gonna have more videos on server components, client components, using them together and all that stuff. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.